Hi, my name is Karen. I'm here to tell you a story. Just imagine that I'm sitting across from you or at the other end of the couch, or we're just sitting together on the floor. Today's story has some mature themes to do with divorce and death and illness. So if you are up for that kind of story today, then I present to you Innings Limit by Brian P. Morgan. The day my father left my mother, he took me to see an Albany Colony minor league baseball game. We were supposed to see a game at Shea Stadium that day, but instead of turning south on the Taconic towards the city, we turned north, and my father apologized because I was wearing my Doc Gooden jersey, the one he bought me earlier that year for my 9th birthday. We sat behind home plate. "Better tickets half the price," he said. But I was inconsolable. Not because it was the day he was to leave my mother, I didn't know that yet, but because the minor league Albany team was the AA affiliate of the New York Yankees. And I hated the Yankees with an unreserved aggression acceptable only in 9-year-olds. An aggression I displayed with 2 glove compartment kicks in the car on the drive there, and by pouting at the urinal long enough to create an angry line once we'd arrived. My parents had been married for 11 years, and before the previous weekend, I had never heard them fight. By the standards I heard about in middle school, their fight was mild. There were no slammed doors, no swearing. The apex of the confrontation was my father, behind their closed bedroom door, raising his voice to a bark. "Like a prison made of money. I'm too bored to keep paying, and you keep raising the bail." In the seats behind home plate, my father bought me a hot dog every 2 innings and a Coca-Cola every 3. He touched my knee with his hand every time he spoke. He didn't talk about that game, specifically, despite an against-the-odds 22nd round draft pick named Pettit making his AA debut and the crowd cheering every pitch. When he spoke, it was with childish reverence for the sport. "The foul lines," he said, "they go on forever. If they moved those fences across the street, the foul lines would meet it. If they moved the fences to Saratoga, they would meet it. An at-bat could go for 20 pitches, could go for a full hour. 9 innings could last days. The game is completely unconfined." We went to 4 or 5 Major League Baseball games a year, always just the 2 of us. At Shea Stadium, we heard the sounds associated with 30,000 reasonably comfortable second-rate New York City baseball citizens who paid for the right to argue against their oppressor. We booed Bobby Bonilla. We mimicked the Atlanta Braves' tomahawk chop as a sign of both our baseball jealousy and of America's blind spot to colonialism. We cheered for Mets home runs, but never predicted we'd see any. Shea Stadium stood as a monument to both Orwellian anger and Buddhist meditation. When the Mets inevitably disappointed, you found a way to reconcile it as an expected consequence of both your station in life and sanity. In addition to the Coca-Cola and hot dogs, my father watched me devour a palm-sized plastic helmet full of soft vanilla ice cream at the game. The walls of my stomach stretched against my rib cage while I sat in the front seat of the car and listened to him explain that he wasn't going to live at home for a little while, that it wasn't my fault, that he loved me, that he had rented an apartment near Grand Central Station, that I could take the train into Manhattan to see him at any point. Within 10 minutes of arriving home, he packed a small bag, not big enough for his suit, so I don't know what he wore to work the next week, and he gave my mother the keys to the car and kissed her on the cheek. She asked if he wanted her to drive him to the train station, and he said he'd rather walk. He hugged me long, in the way that I knew something important was happening. I didn't cry, not because the situation wasn't worthy of it, but because I had fogged his words or their meaning, and the fog had filled a great vacancy in my head. Crying would make the emptiness tangible, so I barely touched him in the hug and smiled dumbly at him when he stood up, red-faced, and touched my cheek. He closed the door behind him, and my mother sat behind the kitchen table. I went to my room and emerged an hour later to ask, "When will Daddy come back?" My mother responded, "How the fuck do I know?" And I bent at the waist and vomited the Coca-Cola and hot dogs on the floor and felt it splash up to stain my Doc Gooden jersey. "He was an eternal optimist," I said of my father during his eulogy 26 years later in front of a congregation that included my mother, his third wife, my wife, and a 32-year-old woman with cancer I'd been sleeping with for the past year. "It's 9 players against a batter," he would tell me every time we went to a baseball game. "But we stand to watch somebody fail 3 out of 4 times just so we can celebrate their victory when it happens." In the car to the funeral reception at my stepmother's house in Chappaqua, my wife held my hand on the manual shift. She hadn't done that since we were in college, and it was one of the few times we've touched in the last years that wasn't perfunctory. "You were eloquent," she said. "I want children," I said. She removed her hand from the gear shift and stared ahead. We were pushing 40, and the lack of children sat between us largely unspoken. We were employed, rich by all standards but New York's, and busy with friends and publications and late hours and workouts and parties and weekends away, and it was hard to find time to even wonder about how it passed. Next to our bed, a bookshelf looked down on us, with book spines facing outward. How to Maintain Muscle Mass. Kale as Superfood. The Habits of Highly Effective Managers. Twice weekly sex tested the portal to an alternate life. Unknown, uncontrolled. When I'd get close to finishing, I'd tell her I want a baby. Let's love somebody new. She'd tell me to come on her stomach or her breasts, and that there are consequences to quick decisions. We promised to talk about it in the morning, but lacked both the courage and time to discuss anything in daylight. A friend I had known since high school was diagnosed with cancer a year earlier, something she told me over coffee near her Brooklyn apartment, and I told her I didn't want her to die without making love to her. And kissing her was like breathing the physicality of death. Muscular passion, her hands on my shoulder blades, behind my head, the pressure of her tongue. This was not performing. This was sex with the scentless decay of organs exposed in her mouth, making us aware of the moment-to-moment use of time, the dripping away of her last year in flesh. She told me to come in her body, and I did, and we both wept in loneliness and anger. After my father's funeral reception, I dropped my wife off at our house in Mount Kisco and told her I was going for a drive, that I needed to be alone. She asked if I was spending the night in the city. I shrugged. She said, "We need to talk." I drove with the windows down toward Brooklyn, on the Sawmill Parkway, and became aware of the detailed world that survived without my father. A red cardinal on a branch of a tree. Somebody's thick son playing basketball by himself on a driveway in a high school sports jersey. I had never considered the lifespan of the George Washington Bridge against that of my father, but there it reached across the Hudson, out of the passenger side window of the car, in all its steel majesty, a monument to utility. A gift from the past to the present, from people who knew it would be useful to those who mindlessly devoured its use. "I'm in the car," I told her, "coming to see you in Brooklyn. You should be with your wife. Tonight, I want to be with you." "I'm not well," she said. "That's why it's important to see you." Until I saw her with a scarf around her head, when she answered the door to her apartment, I had not realized, stupidly, that she was bald. She noticed me looking at the blank smoothness of her head below the wrap. "I didn't expect you," she said. "I preferred you not knowing. It's not sexy to fuck as a sick person." At my father's funeral, she wore a dress with sleeves, makeup, and the wig. Hours later, stripped down to a white t-shirt and black yoga pants, with her arms consisting of mostly tendon and little muscle, her face drawn down, she looked 20 years older than she had that morning. She walked me to her bedroom and took off the scarf, and her baldness glowed in the lamplight from the window. My father once told me if I was intimidated by a woman's looks to imagine her without hair. I never did, but it would have worked. She lay on the bed and curled into my chest and put my hand on her head, directly, and held it there with her own. The both of us felt the light arm hair-like fuzz that grew in errant clumps around her head. I began to feel her heartbeat, still strong, through the tip of her index finger as it pulsed in my hand. I counted the beats as she stared out the window, then briefly at me, before she fell asleep in the triangle of my arm. On the way home, the BQE displayed a directional sign for the Brooklyn Cyclones, the Mets' new minor league team in Coney Island, a place I had promised to take my father, but never did. I understood eventually why he took me to the minor leagues the day that he left my mother, the hopefulness of it, the reinvention, the youth, like an older slugger still thinking he can bring something to a game full of young people, something he tried 2 more times, 2 more marriages, and if he hadn't died, I wonder how many more. Believe in the 8th inning home run, he would say when I was young, something he stopped saying when I got older. Mets fans, hope itself has its limits. It takes less than 1 second to throw a pitch to the plate and for the batter to swing. And in that second, everything can change. It is decided at that moment, all the effort of somebody's life decided in a single second. I never got to ask him the one question I wanted an answer to. Did he think he won? When I arrived home, my wife was in bed reading. She put the book on the bookshelf when she saw me. She said, "I didn't expect you here so early." "It ends," I said. "Eventually, it all ends." "Yes. I'm afraid. I'm afraid too." That was Innings Limit by Brian P. Morgan. Thank you for listening to our story. If you have a story that you'd like us to consider reading on the channel, you can submit it through the link below. Otherwise, we post new stories 2 times a month, once on the 1st and once on the 16th. And I hope you'll come back and hear the next one.